Hey, I'm Adam James, and I wanted to give a little bit of a sort of tour and explanation about how I use Emacs and Literate programming with Clojure. I hesitated to make something like this at first because I don't want to dictate how anyone should set up their editor environment. I think that there's not a single right way to do it. I think over time you kind of figure out the bits that you like, the little tweaks that other people have done that are going to work well with the way you like to work, and other things that won't. My approach to this is to make an example of kind of a minimal setup that I think is quite valuable for literate programming styles with Clojure. I'll get into it now, and I will explain very briefly what literate programming actually means. Literate programming at its basics, we'll go to good old Wikipedia here. It's a programming paradigm introduced by Donald Knuth, not sure how to pronounce his name, in which a computer program is given an explanation of its logic in a natural language, interspersed with snippets of macros and source code from which compilable code can be generated. The way to do that at its most basic, you could use a completely fresh modern Emacs install, and you'll have a thing called org mode built in. Find a file and give it a .org name, or mx org mode will turn org mode on or off. Org mode is powerful in and of itself. It has the ability to add headings, subheadings, sub headings, and so on. This is just normal prose. Everything is just plain text. You can read .org files in any editor. What's really nice about org mode is the ability to collapse and expand headings. You can organize your ideas and your code nicely. If you go over a heading and hit tab, it'll expand or close that particular area. All headings underneath a heading will collapse into it like that. You can also hold the meta key and hit the arrow keys to relocate where different headings are, so you can reorganize your code anytime you want. Your code and your explanations, really nice and simply. You can add code by doing angle bracket and an S, and then hit tab. It'll put in a begin source, end source tag. Cursor's right here, and I can actually define what type of code this particular block will contain. Let's actually do a Clojure script block here, and let's execute this. Hold Control, press X, press E, and that executes the particular S expression you're in. You see the result here. I'm pretty sure that technically Emacs is reading this particular S expression as Emacs Lisp, not Clojure script. So you can see situations where it might seem to be working with a default installation, but that's not a guarantee. If I do Control CC, you can see it's actually executing the Clojure script code block there, and the default org mode setup will chuck the results into a little heading down here called results. And you can tell that it changes. If I change the source here and run it again, you see the result is now 8. It's been replaced. You could do code example, and you could actually produce a little bit of code here and then see the output results here. And you can add more notes wherever you want. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But I used a Clojure script block here, and I sometimes also want to do Clojure code. And let's do CC, and we get some error. Wrong type argument, string P, no. Okay, what's going on? Clojure needs to execute on the JVM. Emacs doesn't spin up a JVM for you. It doesn't know what's going on. There might be ways to set this up in your init.el file, but those are customizations that are currently a little bit beyond what I care to show and what I even bother to use. I'll show you now how I actually do go through this. I have a program installed called, a plugin called Cider. Now, probably most people have heard about Cider if they're interested in Clojure and Emacs. If you want to set up your own workflow with Emacs, you could also look at inf Clojure. I haven't used this too much, but it is a pared down and simple REPL that works like a charm. So if you want something way simpler, because it's maybe easier to customize or easier to understand for whatever reason. Plenty of people also use inf Clojure and it works wonderfully. mx cider jack in will check your current working folder for something like a project.clj file or a deps.eden, and it will use those to set up your class path and load all of the proper Clojure libraries and launch a JVM, set up an nREPL, and connect you to that nREPL. It'll do all of that automatically for you. If you don't have something that makes Cider recognize a Clojure project, it will still launch a REPL for you, but it's asking, do you want to run it without a Clojure project? In this case, I will, because it should still connect me to this current buffer, and I should be able to pass information between the two. I have a keyboard shortcut set up where it'll pass whatever's in the code block or whatever is in the S expression into the REPL here and actually run it. If I wanted to know what 4 times 3 was, I hold meta and press enter, and it sends that expression to the REPL and automatically evaluates it here. I could do functions. Hi viewer. With that alone, there's a pretty useful Clojure development approach. What I actually want to do is use this org file to create an entire Clojure project. The way I do that is a little more advanced. I'll show you that now. Example.org, which is a completely empty file here. I have developed a really simple template for org-based Clojure projects. This is something you don't need at all. It's just something I use and I like it. Sets up the start of a project nice and easily with the org mode as the central source of all the other source files. I do that with Control SL, and then it asks for the name of the library, and I'm just going to call it example. And it just inserted a bunch of different things here into an org file. So if I save this, the directory doesn't exist, I'll create it. No output for that, and that's okay. So if I refresh this header and make a change and save it, you can see that it tangled 4 code blocks from example.org. Now, what does tangling mean? Well, let's have a look here at the files that it created in the example directory. First of all, I saved example.org. It automatically generated test, readme.md, deps.eden, and a source directory. And it did that by doing what's called a org babel tangle. So I have a sort of default header that I put at the top here that has some project specific information. So the deps.eden file here has a name, and then more importantly, it has this begin source Clojure and then a key Tangle, and then the file into which this code will be placed. Let's open up the deps file. This block of code is exactly pasted into here. I'm going to edit this out. I'm just going to make this a much smaller deps.eden. So if I save my file, it tangled 4 code blocks, and you can see the change to the deps file was reflected almost immediately into here. Now you can use this exact approach to also create source and test files without any real problem. So let's open up main.cljc and have a look. I can read through to-do lists, a roadmap. I can read through the design ideas I have for this library. I can put all of my tests in here if I want to. I can do any number of things, but I can also do anything I want here, save that, and I see the changes reflected in the source file here. What is also nice is I can cider jack in to example.org, and it detects correctly that you're in a Clojure project. Opens up a REPL and lets me evaluate all of my symbols into all of the right spots. Now I have the added benefit of using org's tangling features to structure my source files exactly the way I want. So you can just go ahead and add more code sections if you want to. You can always split off a code block into a new one, and this is main code, for example. No problems there. You can evaluate it in the REPL, and you can also open up your source files, and you can see the changes here. What if I realize I wanted to actually save this to its own thing? I can just change the file that gets tangled into, save it, and you can see that since this code block is no longer tangled into the main.cljc source, it actually is removed from that source file. And if I open up hello.cljc file, I see that it exists here. If I change this back, it tangles that code block back into its original spot. And if I change it back to hello, you do have to still be aware of, call them orphaned files. So if you tangle something to scratch.clj, and then later on in your process, you're not saving anything to that at all, you'll have to manually delete it or just be aware of all those extra tangled files you can get. So it's still a one-way kind of connection, but it's often very sufficient for good code organization and everything like that. Now you do want to be careful for the order of source blocks because it will just sequentially tangle everything. A code block that appears earlier in the file will be tangled in first by default. There are things you can look into to change up these sort of capabilities. For example, NoWeb lets you tangle things with references to named source blocks. So what you can do is create some header block of code that you want to be reused in multiple spots, and you can use NoWeb to help you with those things. So if you need to get more advanced information, start searching around with the words NoWeb, Emacs, org mode, and you will be pointed in the right direction. Those are the basics. I want to also quickly open up my config.org file and just highlight a few of the functions that I've worked on to help make this a little bit easier. Take what you want, leave what you don't want, because I should not dictate your Emacs setup. I'm just showing a few different things that work nicely for me. I will have a link in the description to minimum viable setup that is essentially the exact setup that I'm using here. The fun thing about this is, well, fun according to me, I have developed this file in a literate approach. If you go through this, it's not a perfect system because it's always growing and changing. It's got some explanations for things here and there. For example, you can see that in order to use this from a fresh install, you want to save this file somewhere, open it up in your Emacs, and then tangle it. So org babel tangle performs the tangle operation, which means every source block is automatically copy-pasted into a source file. You can read through to get a bit of a picture of what's going on, kind of get an overview without being overwhelmed by the code. Installation is just a bit of pros for the user. Melpa is copied directly from the site to add the Melpa community package archive. Pretty much mandatory for most of this stuff. Selected packages here should, on a fresh install, automatically connect you to Melpa and download all of the correct pieces here. Paredit is a personal preference. You can use this for whatever structural editing you want. Parinfer is also a good choice. Cider. Clojure mode makes sense. Nord theme is the theme that I use. You can, of course, use whatever you want. Async and OB async, OB Clojure script, org babel eval and REPL, and eval and REPL are all related to org mode tangling, org mode execution of Clojure script stuff. These are useful to have. If you don't use Clojure script, you could get rid of that. You could arguably get rid of async and OB async, but they're really nice to have because they keep your tangle process feeling snappy even as your file gets a little bit larger. I would recommend keeping that as is. And then these will just download the packages you don't already have. Global settings. These are totally up to personal preference. For example, I use Control S for save, turn off different modes. I set CUA mode, which it mimics, I think, the Windows default keys, so Control C, Control V, all of that stuff. Some people might not like that, but that's completely up to you. Dev settings. Here we go. I've got a few setups for Cider and Clojure and different hooks. For example, here, add hook, Cider REPL mode hook, enable par edit mode. This particular S expression will mean if you're in a buffer that is a Cider REPL, so if you Cider jack in and then it opens up that new buffer there for you, anytime you go in there, it will enable par edit mode. If you're using parinfer instead, you will have to change this around a little bit. Using your own setup and approach is probably important, right? Just use these as ideas and fit different parts into your setup as you want, or use this in a new setup and tweak it as needed. All of that is totally acceptable. Here we have the most interesting two sections, templates and literate programming. The org mode settings, again, a few of these are personal preference. Startup folded nil, it relates to if the file itself will start with all of the folders collapsed, all of the headings collapsed or expanded. Support shift select always is my preference. I like to hold shift to move the arrow keys to select blocks like this. That is not enabled by default. All of these are just sort of ergonomic choices, and you can take or leave them. And you probably should search what these mean if you care in detail. If you don't care, putting them on is not going to hurt you. Content indentation, I prefer not to have crazy indentation with things. I needed to create this thing called an angle bracket hack. I recommend that you put this on. This is just related to Clojure. You might have something like a thread first or thread last macro in your code. And I found that I was getting complaints that the open and close angle brackets were unbalancing parentheses. Like I had this being considered a paren match, and I don't know where that came from, but this has been the only solution I've found. If someone knows of what's actually happening, please feel free to leave comments about it, link to articles or whatever. I'm totally willing to be wrong on how to fix it, but this has worked for me. Par edit and code block, this is a take it or leave it kind of thing. It doesn't work perfectly, but the idea I have here is in an org mode file, you don't want par edit mode to be on when you're just typing normal prose here. But you do want it to be on when you're editing a source block, especially if it's a Lisp block. The idea was to detect when your cursor is inside source block and enable par edit mode, and disable it when you're not. It doesn't work perfectly because par edit still looks at the entire org file. So if you have unmatched parens in your prose, you will get a par edit error. I've enabled a simple par edit toggle shortcut here, meta capital P. So you do meta shift P and you'll get a message par edit mode enabled or par edit mode disabled. The reason I hesitate to say this is a perfect solution is because enabling of par edit mode runs after post command hook, which happens to occur very frequently. A post command hook occurs after any command, and commands happen when you're navigating, when you're editing, so they happen very often. So it might be resource intensive. It might also constantly conflict with you wanting to enable or disable par edit mode. The very basic solution is actually to disable this functionality, or you could leave it on and experiment yourself. This for sure will be nice and simple, but you can use your own keyboard shortcuts, of course. So the reason that might be nice is you can leave par edit mode on most of the time, but if you want to edit something out without it bugging you, you can temporarily disable it. That's the whole idea there. There's a few keyboard shortcuts I like to set up. I was trying the split keyboard option here. Normally I have it as MS. So you hold meta and hit S inside a source block, and it should split it like this. So you can try set up different keyboard shortcuts or disable it if you want. It also has a built-in where you do Control C, Control V, D. But that was hard to remember, so I tried to change it. You want to set up some of the back ends for evaluating code blocks, and you for sure will want to have this here. So Clojure will load Clojure script, Emacs Lisp, and shell. You can add or remove whatever you want here. There's other options like Python, there's C, I think. There's a lot that you can look into. If you're interested in other Lisp languages, you could set things up for Scheme, you can set things up for Common Lisp. The world's wide open. It's up to you. Literate programming utility functions. I used this here to disable some default behavior that I found confusing and frustrating, where Clojure would try to evaluate in a certain namespace, but that would sometimes conflict with the REPL namespace I was trying to work in. So I just set the current namespace to be basically empty. This is related to why I cannot control CC a Clojure source block, but this is how I enjoy working. I like to write the code and send the things to the REPL that is connected to that context. It just, in my head, it is a nice smooth way of dealing with things. Tangle on save is pretty straightforward. It's not on by default. Tangling by default, you have to do mx org babel tangle, and it will perform a tangle. But you can just add Tangle on save so that anytime you save your file, it will automatically tangle. I don't know why you'd want this off. It's extremely simple, but you might not want it and you can turn it off. Another one here, not as necessary, but this is related to to-do and task management stuff. You can have org mode gather all the to-dos from a bunch of different projects and show them to you based on different queries that you do. That's not for this video. Buffer revert. I have this set up so that when if I have a source file open and I save the org file, it will automatically revert, as in update the buffer to the latest code in the file. If I change a file, it'll show up right away in Emacs. Faster tangling uses async and garbage collection settings. You don't need this, but I found it to be pretty nice. And I do my best to put links to where I got this stuff because I didn't invent all of these approaches. A lot of it is me finding bits and pieces from other people. The last thing that's really interesting is my approach at some basic templating. Take it or leave it. It might not be something useful for you, but I have a little slurp function here that will open up a file that you pass to it. And I have a template reader function, and I have the skeletons that are initiated with certain keyboard shortcuts. What it does here, it loads my templates lib.org and it will replace all of the, it will basically paste whatever library name you pass into the relevant spots so that the folder structure of your library on your first save will be set up nicely. So it'll take care of your deps file, it'll take care of your test directory, your source directory, and it'll make sure that the library name you pass in makes sense. Now, take it or leave it because I don't have a very robust set of checks. I just expect the user to pass in a sensible library name. In particular, I'm not sure that it handles the case of something like lib-clj. I don't know that it automatically converts lib- to lib underscore for file names. So please be aware that this is not a final solution yet. It's just a work in progress, but it is something you can have a look at. I will have a link in the description both to the gist of the minimum viable source as well as a proper repo of this plus the templates folder. So please have a look at those and poke around in those. Take what you want, leave what you don't. That's all I've got to show. That's a little bit of the literate programming style I use when I edit and program in Clojure. I hope this has been helpful for you. Anyone who still has some questions about Emacs and literate programming setup, feel free to leave that stuff in the comments. I might be able to give you good pointers and stuff through comments. I try to be responsive and thorough in my replies, so take that for what it's worth. That's all I've got this time, so thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.